She came 2,000 miles for a man who wasn't there. Clara Whitmore stepped off the train at Harlan Creek Station with a worn leather bag, 43 cents, and the kind of hope that only survives when it has nowhere else to go. The platform was empty. The wind off the Montana hills smelled like pine, and something wilder she couldn't name. She waited an hour, then two. The station master swept the same patch of floor 3 times without looking at her, which told her everything she needed to know about how often this happened to women like her. Like this story? Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story has traveled. The train had pulled out of Harlan Creek at 4:17 in the afternoon, and Clara was still standing on the platform at 6. She had counted everything twice by then. 43 cents, one dress that wasn't the one she was wearing, a photograph of a man named Edmund Hale that she'd read so many times the edges had gone soft, 3 letters tied with a piece of twine she'd saved from a package of flour back in Philadelphia, because even then, even at the beginning, she'd understood, without letting herself admit it, that the letters were all she really had of him. Edmund had written well. That was the thing nobody would understand later when she tried to explain it. He wrote the way men were supposed to speak, but almost never did. He wrote about Montana like it was something he'd built with his own hands, which she supposed he believed. He wrote about the Homestead, the creek that ran behind it, the way the light came down through the pines in the early morning. He wrote about loneliness in a way that recognized hers, and that was what had done it. Not the promise of land or a new life or any of the practical things she told herself later. It was that he had read her loneliness and named it back to her like it was something worth acknowledging. She'd sold her sewing machine for the train ticket. That was the part she didn't tell people. The station master finally stopped pretending not to see her. He was a small man with a gray mustache that didn't quite connect in the middle, and he came out from behind his window with his hat already in his hands, which she took as a bad sign. "Miss," he said. "Whitmore," she said. "Clara Whitmore. I'm expected by Edmund Hale. He has a homestead." "I know who Edmund Hale is." He turned his hat slowly in his fingers. "There's been some trouble out that way." She waited. The wind pushed a scrap of paper across the platform boards. "Mr. Hale took sick," the man said, "about 3 weeks back. Fever, the kind that comes and goes." He paused. "Mostly it came." Clara looked at the photograph in her hand. She'd been holding it without realizing. "How sick?" "Last I heard, they weren't sure he'd come through it." He looked at her bag, then back at her face. "I'm sorry, miss. I truly am. I sent a wire to Philadelphia 2 weeks ago, to the address Mr. Hale gave me in case something came up. But I expect you'd already left by then." She had left 3 weeks ago. She'd been so eager to leave that she'd gone a week early, spent the extra days at her cousin's apartment in Chicago, sleeping on a horsehair sofa, reading Edmund's letters again in the mornings, while her cousin pretended not to feel sorry for her. "Is there somewhere I can—" she started. "Mrs. Aldis runs a boarding house on Teller Street," he said immediately, like he'd already worked this part out. "She's a decent woman. She'll give you a room for the night." He paused again. "There's also— Cole Mercer rides into town most Thursdays. He's a neighbor to Hale's place. He would have been the one to send the message, so he'd know the situation better than I do." "Today is Thursday," Clara said. "Yes, ma'am." He put his hat back on. "Mercer's usually at the feed store by 7, if he comes." She went to the boarding house first, because she needed somewhere to put her bag, and because she needed 5 minutes without anyone watching her face. Mrs. Aldis was a wide woman with flour on her apron and a way of taking stock of a person that was neither unkind nor particularly gentle. She looked at Clara for a moment in the doorway, then stepped back and held the door open. 50 cents a night, she said. Breakfast included. I don't run a charity." "I didn't ask you to," Clara said. Something shifted in Mrs. Aldis's expression. Not quite approval, but something adjacent to it. She showed Clara to a room on the second floor that smelled like cedar and old wallpaper and had a window that looked out over the dark shape of the mountains. Clara set her bag on the floor and sat on the edge of the bed. She did not cry. She was aware somewhere in the practical center of herself that crying was something she couldn't afford right now in the way she couldn't afford a second night at 50 cents. There would be time for it later, maybe. Right now she needed to think. She had 43 cents. She had a return ticket to Philadelphia that she'd kept tucked inside her left shoe since Chicago, a habit her mother had taught her, and that she'd resented at the time as a symptom of pessimism. Her mother had known something. She could use the ticket. She could be back in Philadelphia inside of a week. She could find a new position. She'd had work as a seamstress and before that as a clerk in a dry goods store, and she could fold this whole chapter up and put it somewhere dark and never take it out again. She was 23 years old. There were worse things than starting over. She looked at the window. She thought about Edmund's letters. She thought about the creek he'd described and the pine light in the early mornings. She thought about how she'd read those letters in the back room of the dry goods store on her lunch breaks with the smell of sawdust and dried beans around her, and how the Montana he'd described had felt more real to her than the street outside. She thought about the sewing machine. She put the return ticket back in her shoe, pulled on her coat, and went to find Cole Mercer. The feed store was called Danner and Sons, and it was easy to find because it was the only building on the main street with its lights still burning at 6:30. Through the window, she could see two men talking near a stack of burlap sacks, one of them short and bald with an apron, one of them tall with his back to the glass. She pushed the door open. The tall man turned around, and she understood immediately why the station master had described him the way he had. Not with words exactly, but with a particular quality of careful neutrality that men used when they were trying not to say something complicated. Cole Mercer was somewhere north of 30, dark-haired, with the kind of face that had been weathered by outdoor work until it had settled into something harder and less readable than it might have been. He was not an ugly man. He was the kind of man who looked like he'd stopped caring about that distinction some years back. He looked at her with dark eyes and said nothing. "You're Cole Mercer," Clara said. "I am." His voice was lower than she'd expected. "I'm Clara Whitmore. I've just arrived on the afternoon train. The station master told me you'd be here." She kept her voice level. "I came to marry Edmund Hale." Something moved across his face, not quite guilt, but something that looked like its cousin. He glanced at the store owner, who found something urgent to attend to at the far end of the counter. "Come outside," Mercer said. She followed him out onto the boardwalk. The night air had gone cold, and the mountains to the west were just a darker darkness against the sky. He stood with his hands at his sides and looked at some point past her shoulder for a moment before he looked at her directly. "Edmund's bad," he said. "The fever broke twice and came back both times. He's at the Halverson place. They took him in when it got serious. They've got a woman there who knows something about medicine." He paused. "He asked me to come get you. That's why I'm in town." "He asked you to come get me," Clara repeated. "Yes. It's been 2 weeks since the wire was sent. I've been traveling for 3. She kept her voice level. "When exactly did he ask you?" Mercer looked at her directly now, and something in his expression shifted into something she might have called honest. 4 days ago, when the fever came back worse." A pause. "He didn't know you'd already left Philadelphia." "And before that?" He didn't answer right away, which was an answer. "Before that," she said, "nobody thought to send for me. I'm not going to lie to you and say it was handled well." His voice was flat. Not cruel, just factual, the way a man talks about a fence that's down and needs to be fixed. There was confusion about how bad it was, and then there was confusion about whether, he stopped, whether I was worth the trouble of notifying. "Whether he was going to make it," Mercer said, "and nobody wanted to bring you 2,000 miles for a funeral." The word landed and stayed there. She breathed through it. "What are his chances now?" she asked. "Halverson's woman thinks he'll pull through." "Thinks." He looked away again. "I came to take you to the homestead. It's what Edmund wanted. You'd stay there, be close by, and when he recovers..." He stopped again. "When he recovers," she said. "Not if." "When?" She looked at the dark street. A dog had appeared at the far end of it and was investigating something in the dust. An oil lamp in an upper window of a building across the way cast a yellow rectangle on the boardwalk. This was the moment, she understood. This was the moment where she could use the ticket in her shoe or she could not. It was very simple, in the way that only impossible things are simple. "How far is the homestead?" she asked. "About 2 hours' ride, maybe more in the dark. Do you have a horse for me, or am I riding behind you?" He blinked. That was the only sign she got that she'd surprised him. "I brought a spare." "All right," Clara said. She went back inside to retrieve her bag from where she'd left it leaning against the doorframe, said goodnight to Mrs. Aldis's sign in the window without going back in, and came back out to find Cole Mercer already at the hitching post untying a gray mare with a patient expression. She looked at the mare, then at him. "I've ridden before," she said, before he could ask. "Not much, but enough." He handed her the reins without comment. The ride was mostly silent, which suited her fine. The trail through the Montana darkness was not the trail she'd imagined from Edmund's letters. Edmund had described Montana in daylight, in the best light, the way people describe places they love or want to love. What Clara rode through at 7:30 on a June night was a different country, raw and enormous and almost aggressively indifferent to her presence. The pines came up close on both sides of the trail in places and then opened without warning into stretches of open grass that stretched further than she could see. The sky was extraordinary. That she'd grant it. She'd never seen so many stars, not even in the Pennsylvania countryside, not even on clear nights. They pressed down so close and so dense that they seemed less like a sky and more like something she was inside. Mercer rode ahead, not far ahead, close enough that she could call out if something went wrong, but ahead, which she took to mean he wasn't interested in conversation. That suited her too, right now. She had enough to think about. She thought about Edmund, somewhere in a stranger's house, fighting a fever. She tried to summon something coherent, grief, maybe, or fear, and found instead a kind of numb assessment that she recognized as her own particular way of surviving things. She'd felt it when her father died. She'd felt it when the dry goods store closed and she was out of work for 2 months. It was the feeling of her mind drawing in its edges and getting small and practical, getting down to what needed doing. What needed doing right now was staying on the horse. The gray mare had an easy gait and didn't seem bothered by the dark, which helped. Clara gripped the saddle horn with one hand and let herself move with the animal's rhythm and tried not to think about what she was riding toward. "You'll want to duck here," Mercer said, and she ducked, and a low pine branch passed over her head close enough to brush her hair. "Thank you," she said. He didn't respond. After a while she said, "How long have you known Edmund?" A pause. 7 years, maybe 8. "Is he a good man?" Another pause, longer. He seemed to be choosing something. He means to be. She absorbed that. There was a whole biography in it, she thought, if you knew how to read that kind of careful qualification. "The letters he wrote," she said. "Did he write them himself, or did someone help him?" She heard something that might have been a dry sound in his throat. Not quite a laugh. "He wrote them. Edmund's got a gift for words. He always did." "Just words?" "I said he means to be," Mercer said. "That's more than most." She let it drop. They rode on. But the homestead came up on them at about 9 o'clock, announced first by the smell of pine smoke, then by the shape of a cabin sitting in a clearing with a small light showing through one window. It was smaller than she'd imagined. Everything here was both larger and smaller than she'd imagined. The sky larger, the homestead smaller, the distances between things larger. The warmth of the single-lit window smaller but somehow more significant for it. Mercer dismounted and took her horse's bridle while she got down, which she managed without grace but without falling. "The Halverson place is another hour north," he said. "You'll need rest before we go out there. It'll keep until morning." "Edmund is alive," Mercer said. "Or he was as of yesterday evening, and Halverson would have sent word if anything changed." He tied both horses to the post beside the cabin and looked at her. "You need sleep." She looked at the cabin. "Whose is this?" "Hale's. He stopped, started again. "The homestead you were promised. I've been looking after it while he's been ill." She looked at it again. It was rough. Even in the dark, she could see where the chinking between the logs had been redone poorly, where the roof of the small attached lean-to was sagging toward one corner. The garden bed Edmund had described in such fond detail was a rectangle of churned-up dirt with some dead-looking stalks at one end. "It needs work," she said. "Yes." "A good deal of it." "Yes." He didn't seem apologetic about this fact. She walked toward the door, which he reached past her to push open. Inside, a single room, a stone fireplace with a low fire banked, a wooden table, a rope bed in the corner with a wool blanket, a shelf with a few provisions, an oil lamp on the table, everything plain and spare to the edge of bare. She stood in the middle of it and turned around slowly. Edmund had written about this room. He'd called it small, but honest. He'd written about the fireplace, how on winter evenings it threw good heat all the way to the bed. He had not mentioned how low the ceiling was, or that one of the window frames was visibly warped, or that the place smelled of pine and wood smoke, and something else underneath that she thought might be neglect. But it was real. That was the thing. It was ugly and imperfect and real in a way the letters had never been, and she found, standing in the middle of it, that she preferred the real thing, even the ugly real thing, to the version in the letters. "I'll sleep in the lean-to," Mercer said from the doorway. "If you need anything—" "I won't," she said. "I know," he said, "but if you do—" He went out. The door closed. Clara sat down on the edge of the rope bed. She put her bag on the floor beside her. The fire crackled. Outside, she could hear the horses shifting, and then Mercer's voice saying something low to them, some brief and practical reassurance. She reached into her shoe and took out the return ticket. She held it in her hands for a moment, studying it. Philadelphia and Chicago and Montana, the printing said, which was not exactly what it said, but was the gist of it. She folded it carefully along its creases. Then she leaned forward and put it in the fire. She watched it catch and curl, and go orange, and then gray, and then gone, and she felt something go out of her chest that had been sitting there since Philadelphia. Not hope, exactly, and not fear either, but some combination of both that had been running the show for too long. It was done. There was no more east to go back to. She lay down on top of the blanket with her coat still on, and listened to the Montana night, the wind in the pines, a far-off sound she couldn't identify, the horses, the fire, and did not sleep for a long time. But she stayed. She woke before dawn with a stiff neck and the particular disorientation of not knowing where she was for about 3 seconds before it all came back in a rush. The fire had burned to coals. The room was cold. Through the warped window frame, she could see the sky going from black to deep blue to something that was almost but not quite gray. She got up. She found a water bucket by the door, full, which meant Mercer had brought it in at some point, and she washed her face and hands with the cold water and stood up straight and looked at the room. Then she went to the door and opened it. Mercer was already up. He was at the horse trough around the side of the lean-to, and he looked over at her without expression. "You're up early," he said. "So are you." "Ranchers usually are." She came around to where he was. The morning light was beginning now, really beginning, the sky going pale gold above the eastern hills. And she understood what Edmund had meant about the pine light now, the way it came through the trees at a low angle and turned everything it touched a color somewhere between gold and amber, as if the whole world was being briefly bronzed before the full day came in and rendered it ordinary. "I want to see Edmund this morning," she said. "I figured. He was filling a water trough and didn't look up. We'll ride after breakfast." "What do you have for breakfast?" He paused, looked up. "What?" "To eat. What do you have?" "There's, he seemed to be thinking. "Some cornmeal, salt pork, coffee. Is there a pan?" "Inside on the shelf." "All right," Clara said. She went back inside and found the pan and found the salt pork and the cornmeal and made something that was not quite porridge and not quite cornbread but was hot and filling. And when she called out the door that it was ready, Mercer came in and sat down at the table and ate without complaint and without particular ceremony. She sat across from him and ate too. It was strange, she thought, eating breakfast in the home she'd been promised by a man she'd never met, with a man who was a stranger, in a territory she'd ridden into in the dark. Strange and unglamorous and entirely real. "Tell me about the homestead," she said. "What it needs, what it has, all of it." Mercer set down his spoon. He looked at her with the same unreadable expression he'd been wearing since the feed store. But there was something different in it now, something that might have been recalibration, the look of a man adjusting his estimate of something. "The roof on the lean-to needs to be redone before fall," he said. "The southeast corner of the fence is down. There were cattle getting in and out, but I drove them back last week. The garden was put in too late in the season to amount to much, but the soil's good, it just needs working. The well is good, the creek's reliable. The timber on the north slope is Edmund's to harvest. There's enough there for 2 more rooms and still have plenty. The cabin itself is sound mostly. The window needs reseating. The chinking along the north wall is poor. Clara listened to all of this. What about the land? Is it farmable? Parts of it. More if you cleared the brush on the east side. It's grassland underneath, the kind that'll come back strong if you let it. He paused again. Edmund's plan was cattle mostly. Small herd, build it up over time. That sounds like a plan that requires someone able to work it. Yes. She looked at her hands. They were not soft hands, a seamstress's hands, calloused at the fingertips, used to small, precise work. They were not ranching hands, but she thought they could become them. When Edmund recovers, she said, not if, never if. What happens then? We were to be married. Mercer was quiet for a moment. That's between you and Edmund. I know that. I'm asking what you think. He picked up his spoon. Put it down again. I think Edmund is a man who wrote beautiful letters and had good intentions and got sick before he had to make good on any of them. He said it without cruelty, just with the same flat, factual tone. I think you'll have to decide whether his intentions are enough. Clara looked at the window, the warped frame, the pale morning light coming through it. And what do you think about a woman who came 2,000 miles on the strength of intentions? I think, Mercer said, that she had more courage than the man who sent for her. He stood, picked up both bowls, and carried them to the bucket to wash them. The subject, apparently, was closed. But she sat with what he'd said, more courage than the man who sent for her, and found that it did not feel like a compliment so much as an acknowledgement. He'd seen her clearly, this rancher who'd spoken maybe 24 words to her, and what he'd seen had not struck him as foolish or weak, which was more than she'd expected. She got up and put on her coat. How soon can we leave? She asked. 10 minutes, he said. She nodded and went to wait by the horses. The Halverson farm was further north, tucked into a valley where a creek ran clear and wide over flat stones, and it looked like a place where actual farming was happening. A real kitchen garden, a barn in good repair, a smell of cattle and working land. A woman came out of the house when she heard them ride up. She was older, maybe 50, with iron gray hair and a measuring look. She glanced at Mercer, then at Clara, then back. This is her? She said. This is her, Mercer said. The woman, Mrs. Halverson, Clara assumed, looked at her for a moment with the same quality of assessment as Mrs. Aldous at the boarding house. That frontier habit of reading people quickly because there wasn't always time to be wrong. He's better, she said. Fever broke for good this morning, I think. He's weak as water, but he's himself. She paused. I told him you might be coming. He got agitated. Agitated how? Clara asked. The kind where a man knows he owes an apology and isn't sure how to start. She turned and went back toward the house. Come in then. Gestert. The room was small and smelled of camphor and wood smoke, and Edmund Hale was lying in a narrow bed with his eyes open and his hands folded on his chest, like a man who had recently been very close to dying and still hadn't entirely let go of the idea. He was younger than she'd expected, thinner. His face had the gray, sunken quality of a long fever, and his eyes, when they fixed on her, had the uncertain light of a man who can't quite believe what he's seeing. Clara, he said. His voice was a scratch. Edmund, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. She looked back. She had thought about this meeting for 3 weeks on trains and one night on a rope bed in his cabin. She had rehearsed nothing, which turned out to be the right decision. I didn't know you'd left already, he said. When I got bad, I didn't... I know, she said. The station master told me. I'm sorry. The words came out thin and genuine. Clara, Don't, she said. Not harshly, just cleanly. You can be sorry when you're well. Right now you should drink whatever Mrs. Halverson tells you to drink and get your strength back. She paused. We can talk about the rest when you're sitting up. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Surprise, maybe, or relief, or both. You stayed, he said. I burned the return ticket, she said. His mouth moved, not quite forming a word. Get some sleep, she told him. She turned and walked back out into the morning, into the gold pine light that was fully there now, warm and amber, precisely as he had described it. Behind her, she heard his breathing, slow and regular, the sound of a man letting himself rest. Mercer was waiting at the fence post with both horses. He looked at her when she came out. She looked back at him. "He's going to recover," she said. "Good," said Mercer. "I'll need to learn to do the chinking properly," she said, "on the north wall, before it gets cold." He was quiet for a moment, then, "I can show you." "All right," Clara said. She untied the gray mare and mounted up. Better than yesterday, steadier, and they rode back south through the pine light toward a homestead that was hers by a broken promise, and might someday be hers by something more durable than that. The mountains ahead were clear and high and close, and the trail ran straight into them, and she did not look back. The chinking on the north wall took 3 days. Mercer came on the first morning with a bucket of mixed clay and straw and showed her once, one pass of the trowel, working it into the gaps between the logs with a particular pressing motion, not too thick, not too thin, and then handed her the trowel and watched her do the next section. "You're going too deep on the edges," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm correcting it." He watched another minute, apparently satisfied, and went to fix the fence. That was how things worked between them. Efficient, spare, without much ceremony. He showed her what needed doing, she learned it, and he moved to the next thing. There was something almost restful about it, she found. Back in Philadelphia, every interaction had carried a kind of ambient pressure. The need to be pleasant, to be useful in the right ways, to perform gratitude for work that paid too little and asked for too much. Out here the measure was simpler. Could she do the thing or not? Would she try or not? Mercer didn't seem to care much about anything beyond that, which turned out to be exactly the quality she needed in a neighbor right now. She worked the north wall through the morning, crouching and stretching and getting clay on her hands and her coat, and once, memorably, on her face, which she wiped off with her sleeve and did not mention when Mercer came back around at midday to check the progress. He looked at the wall. He ran 2 fingers along a section she'd done in the first hour, pressing to test the consistency. "Better," he said. She accepted this as the significant praise it was. They ate lunch, salt pork again, and the last of the cornmeal she'd found in the cabin, and she asked him about the cattle plan. Edmund had mentioned it in passing, and Mercer had named it the morning before, but she'd been waiting for a quieter moment to ask properly. "It was always the right idea for this land," Mercer said. He was sitting on the step eating with the plate on his knee, looking out at the property with the assessing squint of a man who sees work everywhere he looks. "The grass comes back strong in spring. You'd need a starter herd, 10, maybe 12 head, and you build from there. It's 3-4 years before you see real profit, but it's steady profit if you manage it right." "Edmund has capital for that?" Mercer was quiet for a moment. "Some. He'd planned to use the money from selling his father's property back east. It came through in March." He paused. "Most of it's still in the bank in Harlan Creek. He didn't get to spend it before he took sick." Clara calculated. A starter herd, fencing, feed through the first winter. It was doable. Tight, but doable. If nothing went wrong, which things always did. "What about you?" she asked. "Your place. How far east?" "Half mile." He looked at her sideways. "You're not going to ask if I'll help." "No," she said. "I'm asking what your situation is, whether you have your own problems or whether you have margin." He looked back at the mountains. "I have margin," he said finally. "This year." She nodded and let it go. That was enough. She wasn't asking for charity, she was mapping the territory, same as she'd map anything unfamiliar. What was there? What could be relied on? What to be careful about? Edmund was still at the Halverson farm. She'd ridden out twice to see him, and each time he'd been a little stronger. Sitting up by the second visit, eating real food, with some color returning to his face that made him look closer to the man in the photograph, though not quite like it. The photograph had been taken in better years, she suspected. He'd tried to apologize again on the second visit, more coherently this time. "I should have written sooner when I got sick," he said. "I should have told you outright. He stopped. "I thought it would resolve quickly and you'd never need to know." "You thought you could manage it without me finding out," Clara said. A pause. "That sounds worse." "It is worse," she said, not unkindly. "But I understand it. You didn't want to scare me off. She looked at her hands. I burned the return ticket, Edmund. I'm not scared off. But I need you to understand that I'm not going to be handled carefully. I'd rather have the truth inconveniently than a comfortable version of it that falls apart later. He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, Mrs. Halverson was doing something with a bucket, the sound carrying clearly through the thin walls. The letters, he said. Were they... Did you find them? Beautiful, she said honestly. Yes. And I believe you meant everything in them. She paused. I also believe that meaning something and doing something are two different actions. I'd like to see whether you can do the second one. He looked at her with those uncertain eyes that were beginning, she thought, to clear. You're harder than I expected. You expected someone softer because I came from a city, she said. People always expect that. He almost smiled. It was the first time she'd seen anything like it, and it changed his face considerably. I expected someone who would be angry. I'm not angry, Clara said. Anger is expensive, and I can't afford it right now. I'm practical, that's all. She rode back to the homestead that evening and finished the north wall in the dying light. The days settled into a pattern after that, and the pattern was work. She was not unfamiliar with work, had never been really, but frontier work was different in kind from anything she'd done before. It was not the detailed, repetitive precision of sewing or the social performance of shop clerking. It was large and physical and demanded a different kind of thinking, a thinking with the body rather than the hands, and in the first weeks her body protested vigorously. She woke each morning with muscles aching in locations she had not previously been aware of having muscles. She did not mention this to Mercer. He would have noticed anyway, she suspected, but he said nothing about it either, which was its own form of respect. She repaired the lean-to roof with his guidance over 4 days in the second week, learning to work with the heavy wooden shingles that overlapped like scales, learning how to seat them so water ran off and didn't pool. She rebuilt the gate on the east side of the fence line. She dug out the garden bed and turned the soil with a spade she found in the lean-to, working it until her back ached and then working it some more, because the soil was genuinely good underneath the neglect, dark and rich and full of possibility, and it felt like uncovering something worth uncovering. You're putting the garden in late, Mercer observed one evening. He'd come around to return a tool he'd borrowed and stayed to look at what she was doing. I know, Claire said, not stopping. Anything I plant now is just for practice, learning the soil. She drove the spade in again. Next year I'll know what I'm doing. He was quiet for a moment. Most people new to this land try to get a full harvest their first year, wear themselves out and get nothing. Most people don't have anything better to do with their expectations, she said. He made that sound again, the dry, almost laugh that she'd noticed on the first night. It was becoming, she realized, one of the ways she measured whether a day had gone all right. If she heard it at least once, the day had probably been tolerable for both of them. He didn't leave right away. He stood at the edge of the garden and looked at what she'd done, and she kept working, and the silence was not uncomfortable. What did you do back east? He asked finally. Seamstress, mostly. Dry goods before that. Your hands are wrong for a seamstress. She looked at them. Calloused, clay-stained now, the nails cut short and practical. They were right for it when I started. Things change. Why did you answer an advertisement from Montana? He asked. Not unkindly. Just the same flat directness he used for everything. She considered how much of the truth to give him and decided on all of it, because partial truths were too much trouble to maintain, and she was too tired for that kind of management. I was 23 years old and I had a room in a boarding house and a job that was going to close in a year when the owner retired, and I had no family left to speak of except a cousin in Chicago I barely know. She turned the spade over and started a new row. Edmund's letters described a life that had room in it, not a romantic life necessarily, just room, space, something to build. She paused. I'm not sure that's an impressive reason. It's honest, Mercer said. Is honesty impressive out here? More than most places, he said. He picked up the other spade that was leaning against the fence post and started working the far end of the bed. She stopped and looked at him. You don't have to do that, she said. I know I don't, he said, and kept going. They worked until the light was gone and then went in and ate whatever she'd managed to put together. She was getting better at it, slowly, learning what stretched and what didn't, how to make the salt pork work harder, how to make something that was at least nutritionally adequate out of limited stores. Mercer ate whatever she made without complaint, which she'd noticed was not quite the same as enjoying it, but he never made her feel judged for the limitations. It was on one of those evenings, over a meal that was not quite soup and not quite stew, that she learned something about Cole Mercer that she hadn't been able to account for just from looking at him. She'd asked, with the same plain directness he used himself, how he'd come to be a Montana rancher. He was quiet long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. "Army," he said finally. 7 years. Out in 73. "Were you in the war?" A pause. He would have been young for the war, very young, but she'd seen what she'd seen. "The tail end of it," he said. 16. He said it like a number, nothing else, no particular feeling around it. And then afterward, there was still Army to be done, further west. Different kinds of trouble. "I'm sorry," she said. "Don't be." Not harshly, just closing a door. It was a long time ago. She looked at his face, really looked, the way she hadn't allowed herself to do yet, and saw what was there that she'd only peripherally noticed before. The set of his jaw. The quality of stillness he carried, not the stillness of a peaceful man, but the stillness of a man who had learned to be very still at certain moments because moving at the wrong time cost too much. She'd seen it in her father, who had come back from somewhere different and quieter than he'd left, and she recognized it now for what it was. She didn't ask any more about it. She refilled his coffee instead and moved the conversation to the fence on the east border, which was still giving trouble, and let him take the escape. Edmund came back to the homestead in the 3rd week of July. He arrived in the back of the Halverson wagon, wrapped in a blanket despite the July heat, and when Mercer and old Halverson helped him down, he stood in front of the cabin for a long moment and looked at what had been done to it. The wall rechunked, the lean-to roof repaired, the gate replaced. The garden turned and planted with the first seeds she'd been able to get from the trading post in Harlan Creek. He looked at Clara. "You did this," he said. "Mercer helped with the roof," she said. "The rest, mostly me." Edmund stood there looking at his own property with an expression she couldn't entirely read. Gratitude, maybe, and something more complicated than that. The look of a man who has been lying still for a month and come back to find the world didn't stop. "It looks better than I left it," he said quietly. "It needed to," she said. She made his bed into the cabin and took the lean-to for herself, which was awkward and impractical and completely necessary, and she was fairly sure Mrs. Halverson and Mercer both understood why and approved of the arrangement without saying so. The next weeks were difficult in a new way. Edmund recovered, but recovery was not a straight line. He had good days and bad days, and on the bad days he was frustrated and short-tempered in the way of men who are used to using their bodies and find themselves suddenly unable to. He'd try to work the fence and run out of strength halfway through and have to stop, and she'd find him sitting on the fence post with his hands hanging and his jaw set. "I can finish it," she'd say. "I know you can," he'd say. And that was the whole problem, right there in 5 words. She understood it. She genuinely did. The particular indignity of watching someone else hold your land together while you sit, the masculine wound of it. But understanding something did not oblige her to pretend the situation was different than it was. And she continued to work because the work needed doing, and standing idle to protect his feelings would help neither of them. Mercer stayed largely to his own property during those weeks, which was the right call. He appeared when there was a specific task that required more than 2 hands, helping to get the fence posts seated properly, riding with Clara to Harlan Creek when she needed to trade some of the preserved meat for seed and flour. But he kept his distance from the homestead itself, and she understood that too. The distance between Edmund and Clara in those weeks was harder to name. He was grateful. She could see that genuinely. He said it more than once and meant it, and she believed him. But gratitude is not the same as closeness, and there was something between them, some gap that the letters had papered over, that was now nakedly there. They had written to each other. They had built an idea of each other. What they had not done was spend time together in a real space, breathing the same air, and the real versions of themselves were discovering, with careful politeness, that they were not entirely what either had imagined. She'd imagined someone more certain. He'd imagined, she thought, someone more yielding. They talked about the cattle plan. He agreed with her assessment of timing, and she was glad to find that his business sense was sound, even when his health wasn't. About Harlan Creek and the people in small social geography she was beginning to learn. About Philadelphia sometimes, cautiously, as if both of them knew it was a country that existed less and less. She did not know what they were to each other. Engaged, technically, still, that had not been formally dissolved, but the engagement felt like a garment she'd brought from home that didn't quite fit the new climate. One evening, near the end of July, sitting on the step after supper with the first hint of fall in the air, because Montana, she was learning, let you feel fall coming weeks before it arrived, he said, "I don't know what you expected of me." "I expected someone who wrote the things in those letters," she said. "I still think that person exists." "But?" "No but," she said. "I'm just being accurate. We have to figure out who we actually are to each other. The letters were a beginning. They're not the whole thing." Edmund was quiet. The mountains in the distance had gone purple and then gray, and the first stars were appearing. "Are you sorry you came?" he asked. She thought about the return ticket, the way it had curled at the edges and gone to ash. "No," she said. "Even with all of it?" "The land is real," she said. "The work is real. The things I've learned are real." She paused. "The rest we figure out." He nodded slowly. He looked tired in a way that was no longer just the fever. It was the tiredness of a man reckoning honestly with his own shortcomings, which was a different kind of exhaustion. She found she did not resent him for it. He was trying. That was worth something. The wind came down off the mountains and pushed through the pines with a sound like distant water, and they sat there for a while longer, not talking, not needing to, the silence between them finally approaching something that didn't require explanation. Then he said quietly, "I should have been here when the train came in." "Yes," she said, "you should have." And that was all. It was enough. August came in hard. The heat that settled over the valley in the first 2 weeks of the month was the kind that made the air above the dirt roads shimmer and turned the creek down behind the property sluggish and low. The cattle that Mercer ran on his land, a small herd, 14 head, drifted toward the water and stood there in the shade of the cottonwoods, barely moving. Even the insects seemed to slow down. Clara worked in the early mornings and the evenings and spent the hottest part of the afternoon doing the indoor tasks, mending, preserving what came out of the garden, working on the accounts Edmund had started keeping in a cloth-covered ledger that she'd taken over without discussion, because his handwriting went crooked when he was tired and the numbers needed to be right. The garden had surprised her. She'd planted it late, called it practice, kept her expectations low, and then the Montana soil had done what Mercer said it would, and come back strong. The bean plants were climbing their stakes. The squash had spread further than she'd anticipated and was encroaching on the row of carrots in a way she'd have to manage. 2 rows of potatoes that she'd put in with no particular confidence had produced actual potatoes, which she'd dug up with something close to disbelief and shown to Edmund like evidence of a small miracle. "You sound surprised," he'd said. "I put them in the ground and they made more of themselves," she said. "I'm going to be surprised every time." He'd laughed at that. A real laugh, not the careful kind he'd been using since he got back, the kind that keeps a distance. And she'd filed it away as one of the better moments of the month. Edmund was stronger. Not fully, not yet, but the trajectory was clear and moving in the right direction. He could work a half day without stopping now. He'd taken back the fence repairs on the west side, doing them slowly and methodically, and she'd stopped watching to make sure he didn't overdo it because he'd told her, with reasonable plainness, that being watched made it worse. She understood that and stayed away. They had arrived by August at something functional, not what the letters had promised, but something that had the quality of being built rather than imagined, which she found she trusted more. They ate together in the evenings. They talked about the land, the plans for the cattle purchase they were still working toward, the small news from Harlan Creek that she brought back from her weekly rides into town. They had not talked again about what they were to each other, and she had decided to leave that question alone for now because there was too much else that needed doing, and some questions answer themselves if you give them enough time. It was on one of those evening rides back from Harlan Creek in the second week of August that she passed Mercer on the trail. He was coming from the direction of town himself, riding the big bay he usually used for distance, and they met on the stretch where the pines thinned and the trail ran open along the ridgeline, with the whole valley visible below. He slowed when he saw her, and she slowed, and they rode side by side for a stretch without talking, which was comfortable in the way that silence between people who have worked together gets to be comfortable. "Mail come in today," he said after a while. "Anything for the homestead?" He was quiet in a way that had something in it. "There was a letter," he said. "At the post. I didn't bring it. The postmaster will hold it. You can pick it up yourself." "Why didn't you bring it?" He looked at the trail ahead. It was addressed to Edmund, from a woman named Hale in Virginia. Clara absorbed this. "His sister?" "He doesn't have a sister," Mercer said. She looked at him. "It's his mother," Mercer said. "Or was. She passed in June, apparently. The letter's from the family attorney, settling the estate." "And?" He was quiet again, longer. They rode down off the ridge and into the shade of the pines before he spoke. "Edmund's father left property, more than his mother let on when he was alive. The attorney wants him to come back to Virginia to handle the settlement." A pause. "It's a significant amount, from the sound of it." Clara thought about this carefully. Edmund had come west, she understood now, because there had been nothing east worth staying for. A difficult father, a mother who'd kept the peace by keeping secrets, a life that hadn't fit him. The money from his father's first property sale was what had bought the Montana land. If there was more now, how long would it take, she said, to go to Virginia and handle it? Month, maybe 2. He didn't say the rest of it, but it was there in his tone. A month or 2, and Edmund could come back different. Could not come back at all, if Virginia pulled at him. People fell back into old lives when those lives had money in them. "You should have just brought the letter," she said. "I thought it would be better coming from me first," he said. "So you had some warning." She looked at his face in profile, the set of it, the straight line of his mouth. "You were looking out for me." "I was being practical," he said. "Cole?" she said. He turned to look at her, and she wasn't sure what either of them expected to happen in that moment. But what happened was that she held his gaze for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and then looked back at the trail, and the air between them had a different quality afterward, something slightly charged that she was not prepared to examine. "Thank you," she said quietly. He nodded once and urged his horse ahead on the trail, and she let him go. She picked up the letter the next morning and brought it back to Edmund without opening it. That was never a question. And watched his face change as he read it. The expressions moved through him like weather, surprise, then something complicated that might have been grief or relief, or some mixture of both, then a particular quality of stillness that she associated with him when he was working through something he didn't want to say out loud. He folded the letter and held it. "My mother died," he said. "I'm sorry," she said. "We weren't—" He stopped. "She and I were complicated." He looked at the folded letter. "There's property, more than I knew." "I know," she said. "Mercer told me a little." He looked up, then down again. "I have to go back." "I know." "The land here—" "We'll be here when you come back," she said. "I'll be here." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw in his face the question he was actually asking, which was not about the land. "You're sure?" he said. She wasn't sure. Not the way he wanted her to be sure. She was sure of the land. She was sure of the work. She was sure of herself in a way she hadn't been in Philadelphia. About Edmund, about what they were building or trying to build between them, she was sure only that she was willing to find out. "Go handle your business," she said. "Come back and we'll figure out the rest." He left 3 days later, at the end of August, with his bag and the attorney's letter and the stiff posture of a man carrying more than luggage. He shook Mercer's hand on the trail where their properties met. He turned to Clara, and there was a moment, awkward, genuine, not quite resolved, where he took her hand in both of his. "All right," he said. "I'd like that," she said. And she meant it. She watched him ride toward Harlan Creek until the pines took him, and then she went back to the homestead and stood in the cabin and looked at the space he'd left in it, which was significant, and waited for some feeling to arrive that would tell her what to do with herself. What arrived was not grief, not relief, not certainty. What arrived was the particular clarity that comes when a complication you've been managing quietly is suddenly gone, and you can finally see the shape of the thing underneath. She went out and checked the bean plants. September came and brought with it the first suggestion of the fall Mercer had warned her was coming. Mornings that started cold and warmed up, evenings that reversed the process faster than she expected. The light changed, lower and more golden, and the mountains to the west caught it differently, held it longer. She understood now why Edmund had written about it. Even knowing the letters had been partial truths, the Montana light in September was genuinely worth writing about. She and Mercer fell back into the working rhythm that Edmund's presence had slightly altered. He came over in the mornings 2 or 3 times a week. She cooked what there was. They worked whatever needed working. She was learning the land in a way that felt like genuine knowledge now, not just instruction, where the soil drained poorly after rain, which section of fence would need replacing before winter rather than after, how to read the sky in the late afternoon when the clouds built up over the western peaks. Mercer taught her to ride properly, not just stay on the horse riding, which she'd managed since that first night, but working riding. How to move cattle with your body position before your horse did anything, how to check a horse's hooves and what to look for, how to saddle and unsaddle efficiently in the dark if she had to. He taught these things the same way he taught everything, demonstrating once, then stepping back and watching, correcting specifically and without elaboration when she was wrong, saying nothing when she was right. She asked him once why he never said when she'd done something well. He looked at her with a slightly puzzled expression. "I keep asking you to help with things," he said. "That's what I do when someone's doing them right." She thought about this. He wasn't wrong. If something wasn't working, he told her immediately and specifically. If he kept asking her to do it, it was working. It was a simple, entirely consistent system that she'd somehow taken 3 months to decode. "I grew up with a teacher who only ever told me when I was wrong," she said. "I think I've been waiting for it. Waste of time," he said. "Waiting for things people aren't going to give you." He said it without particular feeling, as a simple observation, but it landed somewhere and stayed there. October came, and with it the first real cold. Not the suggestion of cold, actual cold, the kind that made the water in the bucket ice over by morning and turned her breath to vapor inside the lean-to. She'd known it was coming. She'd spent September preparing for it. The firewood she and Mercer had cut and stacked along the south side of the cabin. The preserves she'd put up from the garden. The extra blankets she'd traded for in Harlan Creek. She'd insulated the lean-to with what she had, which was not quite enough, and added a second wool blanket to her bed and told herself it would serve. The first truly cold night, she woke at 3 in the morning to a temperature that had no business being what it was inside a structure attached to a heated cabin, and lay there calculating, practically and without sentiment, how long she could manage this before it became a health problem. By morning, she'd decided to move her sleeping arrangements into the cabin itself. Edmund was gone. The proprietary issue was resolved. She told Mercer when he came over, as a plain statement of fact, and he looked at her with the same steady expression he used for everything and said, "Took you long enough." She moved her things. The cabin was warmer and she slept better and the problem was solved. And she noted the absence of any complicated feelings about this, the same way she noted it when a fence repair held through a rain, with straightforward satisfaction. It was in the second week of October that things between them shifted. She wouldn't have been able to say exactly when, or point to the single moment if she'd tried. It was more like a tide than a line, something that had been moving in for a while and one day you looked down and found the water already at your feet. They were working the east pasture, clearing the brush she'd been meaning to clear since summer, and it was cold but the work was warming them. And she'd said something. She couldn't remember afterward exactly what. And he'd said something back that made her laugh, a real laugh, undignified, surprised out of her. And when she looked up, he was smiling, not the dry almost laugh. An actual smile, brief and unguarded, the kind that happens before a person can decide whether to let it. She'd seen glimpses of it before, pieces of it, but not that, not all at once. And it changed his face so completely that she stood there for a moment looking at him like she was seeing him for the first time, which in one sense she was. He stopped smiling when he noticed her noticing. He turned back to the brush pile and said something practical about the fence line, and the moment closed, and they went back to working. But it stayed with her. That evening, over supper, she'd gotten the salt pork to a point where it was genuinely good. She'd finally worked out the spicing. She found herself watching him across the table and registering things she hadn't let herself register before. The way he held his coffee cup with both hands in the cold, the small, precise economy of all his movements. The fact that at some point in the last 4 months she'd stopped having to translate his silences and had started simply understanding them. She thought about Philadelphia. She thought about the letters. She thought about Edmund, somewhere in Virginia, doing something she couldn't picture clearly. A man she'd come to know a little and liked in a partial way that was honest but insufficient. She thought, this is trouble. Not in a frightened way. In the way you name a thing accurately so you can deal with it properly. She was not a person who acted on feelings at the expense of clarity. She was a person who named things and then managed them. So she named this. She had come to care about Cole Mercer in a way that was more than the gratitude one felt toward a useful neighbor. She had come to know him in the way you come to know someone when you work alongside them long enough and they stop performing and start simply being. And what she knew was complicated, as people always were, but underneath the complication, something she recognized as fundamentally decent. A man who had been badly used by the world and had not become cruel because of it, who kept his word without announcing it, who saw her clearly without finding what he saw disappointing. She didn't say any of this. He finished his coffee, thanked her for supper, and went back to his place in the dark. She sat by the fire for a long time after, not reading, not working, just sitting with the thing she'd named and letting it be complicated. Edmund's first letter arrived the following week, sent from a staging town in the Dakotas. He'd been delayed by weather on the way east. He wrote carefully and at length about the property situation in Virginia, about his mother's house, and the attorney and the other inheritors, and at the end, almost in passing, he wrote, I have been thinking about us, Clara, and about what I asked you to wait for. I want to do right by you. I am still working out what right looks like. She read this twice. Then she folded it and put it on the shelf and went to check the firewood supply. Because there was a particular quality to the sky that afternoon that Mercer had told her meant weather, and she wanted to know what they had before it arrived. The first snow came that night, not a light snow, a real one, the kind that fell straight down in the windless dark and accumulated with a quiet efficiency that was almost aggressive, covering the garden bed and the fence line and the roof of the lean-to and every surface of the world she could see from the cabin window until it was all one undifferentiated white. She stood at the window and watched it for a while and felt, not fear exactly, but a heightened attentiveness, the feeling of a world that was telling you to take it seriously. She banked the fire and went to bed and woke to 4 inches on the ground and more coming. Mercer arrived mid-morning with his breath clouding and a look on his face that she'd learned to read as controlled urgency. The far fence is down on the north side, he said. Cattle are loose. What do you need? She said. He told her. She saddled the gray mare, better now, efficiently, the way he'd taught her, and they spent 4 hours in the snow moving cattle and repairing fence, cold to the bone, her hands aching inside her gloves. And when it was done, they came back to the cabin and she made coffee, and they sat at the table and neither of them spoke for 10 minutes because they were simply too tired. Then he looked up and said, You handled the mare well in the snow. She looked at him. Is that a compliment, Mercer? He looked back at his coffee. It's an observation. She felt the laugh before she heard it, her own laugh, warm and sudden in the cold cabin. And she heard him make that sound, the dry, almost laugh. And this time it didn't quite stay in the almost. Outside, the snow kept coming. The mountains had disappeared into it, and the world had drawn itself down to the size of this cabin, and the light from this fire, and the two of them at either side of this table, and for one unguarded moment she thought, I would not trade this. She did not say it, but she didn't look away from him for a moment, and he didn't look away from her. And what passed between them in that moment was something that had been building quietly, without permission, since the night she'd ridden through the dark on a spare horse into a life she hadn't planned and found herself in the company of a man who, against all practical expectation, had become the most reliable thing in it. Then he stood and put on his coat and said he needed to get back to his own cattle. And she said she understood, and the door closed behind him. She sat with her coffee, outside the snow. The snow stayed for 11 days. Not continuously. It would ease off for a few hours, sometimes most of a day, and she'd go out and dig the path to the lean-to and check the woodpile and look at the sky with the new literacy she'd been developing, reading the clouds the way Mercer had taught her, deciding whether this was a pause or an ending. Mostly, it was a pause. The second fall would come before the first had properly settled, and she'd stand in the doorway watching it start again, with a feeling that was not quite dread and not quite admiration, but something between them. She was not lonely, exactly. That surprised her. She'd expected to be, the enforced proximity to her own thoughts, the absence of anyone to talk to for stretches of 2 and 3 days at a time when the weather made travel impractical. But she'd been lonely in Philadelphia in ways this wasn't. She'd been lonely in a crowd of people who knew her name and saw her every day, the kind of loneliness that comes from being surrounded by people who see you without really looking. Out here, the solitude was at least honest. It named itself. She could work in it rather than perform through it. She kept the fire, managed the provisions, wrote in the back pages of Edmund's ledger. Not accounts, just notes to herself. Observations about the land and the weather, and occasionally her own thinking, which she'd never done before and found unexpectedly useful. She read the 2 books she'd brought from Philadelphia until she'd absorbed them so thoroughly they stopped surprising her. She thought about Edmund's letter, the careful words at the end of it. I am still working out what right looks like. She thought about Mercer. She was honest with herself about this in the ledger, in the back pages where she wrote in a hand small enough that it would take effort to read. She'd always been better at honesty on paper than out loud. The seamstress's precision, maybe, the habit of measuring twice. What she wrote was not romantic. It was more like an inventory. What she knew about him, what she didn't know, what she could reasonably infer, what she had no right to assume. He had not said anything. He had not done anything. He had looked at her across a table in a snowstorm and not looked away, and she had done the same, and that was the whole of the evidence. It was not nothing, but it was not enough to act on, and she was not a person who acted on insufficient evidence. Edmund's second letter arrived the week the snow finally stopped, brought out from Harlan Creek by the postmaster's son who made rounds on the cleared trail. It was longer than the first. He'd reached Virginia. The estate was more complicated than the attorney had indicated. His mother had kept certain debts quiet, and the property value was partially offset by what was owed. He was sorting through it. He was staying at the family house, which he described in 3 sentences with a peculiar flatness that told her more than the words. He asked how the homestead was holding up under the weather. At the end, I think of you there, managing everything, and I feel 2 things at once, pride and something else I don't have a clean word for. I wonder sometimes if I built something in those letters that I couldn't live up to in person. I think you know the answer to that better than I do. She sat with this letter longer than the first one. He was being honest, she thought, more honest than he'd been capable of being in August, when the illness and the recovery and the gratitude had all been too fresh, and he'd managed their conversations carefully. This had the quality of a man who'd had distance and time, and the particular perspective that came from sleeping in his childhood house and finding it smaller than he remembered. She wrote back the same afternoon, while the light was good, and the trail was clear enough that she could ride to Harlan Creek herself and post it. She wrote about the homestead, what had held, what needed doing in spring, the cattle plan, the garden she was already sketching out in her head for next year. She wrote about the snow and what she'd learned from it. And then she wrote carefully, I think you're right that you built something in the letters you couldn't live up to. I think I did the same. The difference is that I'm here and the land is here, and we have the option of building something real instead, if that's what we both want. I don't know yet if it is. I think you need to finish what you're doing there before either of us can know. She sealed it and rode to town. Mercer was at the feed store when she came out of the post office. She saw his horse at the hitching post before she saw him, and then he came out with a burlap sack over one shoulder and stopped when he saw her. Road's clear enough for you to ride, he said. As you can see, she said. He tied the sack to his saddle. She watched him work the knot, quick and sure, the way he did everything. I was going to come check on the homestead this afternoon, he said. Make sure the lean-to held. It held, she said. The south corner of the roof has a soft spot. I put a bucket under it. I'll fix it. I know how to fix it, she said. I was hoping you'd show me once and then I'd know for next time. He looked at her with the slight recalibration expression she'd come to know, the one that meant she'd said something he'd underestimated. All right, he said. They rode back together and he showed her the lean-to repair, which took most of the afternoon. She did 2/3 of it herself while he watched and made the 2 corrections he found necessary, both of them precise and brief. And when it was done, they stood back and he pressed the new shingles with his palm to test the seat. "Good," he said. "Observation, not compliment," she said. He glanced at her sideways. Both this time. She turned back to the lean-to and was glad her face wasn't visible for a moment. November deepened and hardened. She had 3 more letters from Edmund, shorter as the month went on, more businesslike, updating her on the estate settlement, which was nearly resolved. He wrote that he expected to return before Christmas. He wrote that the Virginia house had been sold and that there would be capital, enough to buy the starter herd they'd planned and then some. He wrote about what he was thinking. He did not write the word love, which he had used in the letters from before she came, and she noticed its absence the way you notice when a piece of furniture has been moved. Not wrong, exactly, but different. She wrote back honestly and warmly and without the word either. The town of Harlan Creek had opinions about Clara Whitmore by November, and she was aware of them in the sideways way that a newcomer becomes aware of community judgment. Through the slight adjustments in how people talked to her, the questions that were asked and not asked, the specific quality of the courtesy extended by Mrs. Aldis and the station master and the woman who ran the dry goods, which was decent enough but carried within it a kind of held breath, a waiting. She understood what they were waiting for. The story as they understood it. A woman had come to marry a man who got sick before she arrived. The man had gone back east. The woman had stayed and was living alone on his property and spending a notable amount of time with Cole Mercer, who had been on his own since before most of them could remember and was not, as far as anyone in Harlan Creek could see, the marrying kind. She didn't find the story unfair particularly. It was more or less what was happening, stripped of its interior complexity. She couldn't explain the interior complexity to the dry goods woman without seeming either naive or dissolute, so she didn't explain it at all. She was polite and direct and paid what she owed and didn't linger for gossip, and she let the town form its opinions, which it would do regardless. Mercer, she knew, was receiving his own portion of community opinion. She'd seen it once directly. A conversation at the feed store that stopped at the wrong moment when she came in. A quality of masculine solidarity being performed for her benefit that served mostly to confirm what they'd been discussing. She hadn't said anything. He hadn't said anything. They'd ridden home separately, and she'd thought about it later, sitting by the fire, and decided that the opinion of men in a feed store was not a thing she was prepared to organize her life around. The more significant conversation happened in November, unexpectedly, not in town, but on the trail. She'd been riding back from checking the fence line on the north end of the property. She'd taken over the regular fence checks in October without making a formal announcement about it, simply because it needed doing, and she was the one available to do it. When she came across a woman she'd seen in town but never spoken to, riding in the opposite direction with a wrapped package tied to her saddle. The woman's name turned out to be Ruth Calloway. She was 40-something, straight-backed, with the kind of face that had been good-looking 20 years ago and had since become something more interesting. She stopped and introduced herself with the directness that Clara was coming to think of as a Montana quality, or perhaps just the quality of people who'd had the patience worn out of them by the landscape. "You're the Whitmore woman," Ruth said. "I am," Clara said. "I wanted to say—" She paused in a way that seemed genuine rather than calculating. "I know it's none of my business, but I was in your situation once. Came out here for a man who couldn't be what he'd promised. I went back east." She looked at the mountains. "Spent 15 years regretting it. Not the man, the land, the chance." She looked back at Clara. "I just wanted someone to say to you that staying was the right thing, even if it gets complicated." Clara looked at her. "How complicated?" she asked. Ruth Calloway smiled. The first real smile Claire had received from a Harlan Creek resident that wasn't mixed with something else. "However complicated you let it get," she said. "That part's up to you." She rode on. Clara sat on the gray mare and watched her go, and sat with that for a long time before riding back to the homestead. December arrived. Mercer had been helping her reinforce the cabin for the deepest winter nights, the kind of work that was unglamorous and critical, sealing places where cold got in, making sure the wood supply was adequate, checking the structural integrity of the lean-to now that the repair was done. He came most mornings and they worked until early afternoon and she fed him lunch, and the pattern was so established by now that neither of them noted it. It had the texture of something that had always been. One afternoon, mid-December, they were inside the cabin. She was working on a tear in her heavy coat that had gotten worse, and he was mending a piece of harness at the other end of the table. And the silence between them had been easy for a long time when he said, without looking up, "Edmund coming back before Christmas." She threaded her needle. "He wrote that he hoped to. How do you feel about that?" She looked at him. He was looking at his work, pulling the leather through carefully, not looking at her. "Honestly," she said. "When do you not talk honestly?" She considered the question she was actually being asked, which was not precisely about Edmund. "I think he's a decent man who tried to offer me something and couldn't quite be what the offering implied," she said. "I think when he gets back we'll have an honest conversation and work out what we both actually want." She paused. "I don't think it will be what we started with." Mercer pulled the leather through, said nothing. "You could say something," Clara said. "Nothing to say." Mercer. He set the harness down and looked at her directly, and whatever he'd been keeping in the steady expression he maintained for most things was slightly closer to the surface now. "There are things," he said carefully, "that aren't mine to say yet." She held his gaze. "Yet," she said. He picked the harness back up. "Yet," he confirmed quietly, and went back to his work. She went back to hers, and the fire crackled, and outside the December wind came down off the peaks with a sound like something large and patient waiting. Edmund arrived on the 19th of December, 3 days before Christmas, on the afternoon stage from Harlan Creek. Clara met him at the Homestead. He'd sent word ahead, and he came in from the cold looking like a man who'd done something difficult and finished it. Better than when he'd left, she thought. Older in a different way. He'd been sick and recovered and handled his family's complicated aftermath and come back with something settled in him that hadn't been there before. He stood in the cabin doorway and looked at what it had become in his absence. She'd added to it over the fall. Nothing significant in isolation, but the accumulation of small things made the place look cared for in a way it hadn't when he'd left. The shelves were organized. The table had a cloth on it now, traded for in Harlan Creek. The window frame had been properly reseated, the warped wood replaced, and through it the winter light came in clean and square. The garden was under snow, but the fence posts were straight and the gate sat plumb in its frame. "You've been busy," he said. "The work was here," she said. He came in and she put coffee on and they sat, and it was different from any of the conversations they'd had before, less cautious, both of them past the point of careful performance. He told her about Virginia, about the house, about sorting through his mother's things and finding in them a portrait of a woman more complicated than he'd been allowed to know. He talked about it without flinching and without self-pity, which she found she respected considerably. Then he looked at her across the table and said, "You and Mercer." She met his eyes. "What about it?" "I'm not asking as an accusation," he said. "I'm asking because I wrote you a letter in October that said I was working out what right looked like. And I think you wrote back something that said you didn't know yet either." He wrapped his hands around his cup. "I've worked it out." She waited. "I came here because I wanted something new," he said. "And I wrote those letters because I had something real to offer. The land, the plan, a good intention. What I didn't have was—" He stopped. "I didn't have what it takes to be the man in those letters every day. In the real days, the hard ones. I think I knew that when I was writing them, a little, and I convinced myself it would come." He looked at her steadily. "You found it in someone else. I'm not sure either of us chose that, but it's true." She was quiet for a moment. "You're more perceptive than you let on," she said. "I had 2 months in my dead mother's house to think," he said. "It clarifies things." "Edmund, I'm not hurt," he said, "or not more than a man should be when he understands he wasn't equal to what he asked for." He sat forward. "I want to do right by you, Clara. That's still true. What right looks like, I think, is this. I'll sign my interest in the homestead over to you, legal and clear. You've worked this land from the day you got here. It's more yours than mine." He paused. "What I keep is the capital from the estate. I'll go further west, California maybe, and start something there, clean." She stared at him. "You're giving me the homestead," she said. "I'm acknowledging what already is," he said. "That's different." She was quiet for a long time. The fire settled in the grate. Outside the cabin, she could hear the wind picking up, the particular high note it made through the gap in the pines to the north. You don't have to do that, she said finally. I know I don't, he said. And the words were so like something Mercer had said to her once, under entirely different circumstances, that she felt for a moment the strange vertigo of two men being unexpectedly decent at the same time. You're a better man than you gave yourself credit for, she said. He smiled at that, the smile she'd seen once before, in the sick room at the Halverson farm, the one that changed his face. Give me time, he said. I'm working on it. She told Mercer the next morning. She found him at the fence line where their two properties met. It was where she'd come to understand she could find him most mornings, as if he positioned himself instinctively at the boundary of what was his and what wasn't. He listened without interrupting while she told him what Edmund had said. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, looking at the mountains. He's a better man than I gave him credit for, Mercer said. I told him the same, Clara said. He turned to look at her. The winter light was full and cold on his face, and she could see him working through something. Not hesitation exactly, but the careful deliberateness of a man who has been private for so long that speaking certain things requires actual effort. The homestead's yours, he said. Properly. Yes. And you're staying. I burned the return ticket in June, she said. Nothing's changed about that. He nodded slowly. He looked at the fence line, at the boundary between his property and what was now, legally and clearly, hers. When he looked back at her, his expression had the quality she associated with him when he'd made a decision. Not warm, exactly, but open in a way that was the closest thing to warmth he did easily. I've been thinking, he said, about the north pasture. My north and your east share a corner. If we took that fence down and ran the combined acreage as a single unit, we'd have enough to sustain a herd of 20, maybe 25. He paused. That's the kind of operation that's viable long term, that two people can run without breaking. She looked at him. You're talking about combining the properties, she said. I'm talking about taking a fence down, he said carefully. What it means beyond that is a separate conversation, one thing at a time. She studied his face, the careful deliberateness of it, the precision with which he was moving towards something without moving too fast, without asking for more than was right to ask for right now, because he was a man who understood that some things needed to be built at the right pace or they didn't hold. One thing at a time, she agreed, and she looked out at the snow-covered pasture, at the fence line that ran between two properties that might, with time and work and the right kind of patience, become something neither of them had managed to build alone, and felt the steady particular warmth of something not yet named, but already, quietly, real. Edmund left on the 28th of December. He left quietly, the way he'd done most things toward the end, without ceremony, without the kind of drawn-out farewell that would have made it harder for everyone. He settled the legal matter with a land attorney in Harlan Creek before he went, a man named Briggs, who drew up the transfer documents in 2 days and seemed entirely unsurprised by the arrangement, which told Clara something about how often the frontier produced situations that didn't fit the standard forms. She signed her name on the documents in Briggs's cold office and felt the particular solidity of something becoming officially real that had already been practically true for months. The homestead was hers. 70 acres of Montana, a cabin, a lean-to with a new roof, a garden that had survived its first winter under snow, a fence line that was mostly sound, soil that was better than it looked. Edmund shook Mercer's hand at the trail junction the morning he rode out. There was a moment between them that she didn't try to hear. Low voices, brief. And then Edmund turned to Clara and took her hand and held it. "Write me when the cattle come," he said. "I will," she said. "And when things—" He stopped, looked at Mercer, then back at her. "Just write me, when things happen." She understood what he was saying. He wanted to know that the life he'd described in letters, the life he hadn't been equal to in person, had actually happened for someone. She thought that was a decent thing to want. "All right," she said. He rode east toward Harlan Creek with his bag and his Virginia capital, and the particular posture of a man who has resolved something and is ready, finally, to start something else. She watched him go until the pines took him, and then she turned and walked back to the homestead. And Mercer walked beside her, and neither of them said anything because there was nothing that needed saying yet. January was the hardest month. She had been warned. Mercer had told her in October, plainly, without dramatizing it, That January in this valley was the month that broke people who weren't ready for it. Not the snow necessarily, or even the cold, but the combination of both, with a darkness that set in before 4 in the afternoon and didn't lift until nearly 9 in the morning, and the isolation that came with trails impassable for days at a time and a world reduced to the radius of what you could see from your own window. He had not been wrong. There were 3 days in the second week where the temperature dropped to something she had no vocabulary for. Not cold as a description, but cold as a physical fact. The kind that got through every layer and sat in the bones and made the simple act of crossing from the cabin to the lean-to for firewood feel like a negotiation with the world about whether you were serious. The water in the cabin froze overnight despite the banked fire. One of her bean plants, which she'd been wintering inside on the sill just to see if she could, died in a single night, the leaves going limp and pale by morning. She managed. She managed because she had enough wood. They'd cut considerably more than she'd thought necessary in September, and she'd been right to let Mercer override her estimate on that. And enough provisions, and because she'd learned over the fall to move through the cold efficiently rather than fighting it, the way you learn to work with difficult material rather than against it. She managed because she was stubborn in a way that had nothing to do with pride and everything to do with the simple refusal to be beaten by something as impersonal as weather. And she managed because Mercer came every day he could, or sent some sign when he couldn't. On the worst days, when she couldn't see his property through the snow, she'd find a fresh piece of firewood stacked at the lean-to door in the morning that hadn't been there the night before, which meant he'd come out in the dark to check on her and hadn't wanted to wake her. And the fact of it, that particular form of silent, practical care, did something to her chest that she'd stopped trying to categorize. On the days he could come, he came for hours. They worked on whatever the weather allowed, and when it allowed nothing, they sat inside and he repaired things. There was always something that needed repairing: a tool handle, a piece of harness, a section of the garden fence she'd stored in the lean-to. And she worked on the books, or wrote in the back of the ledger, or simply sat with her coffee and watched the snow outside the window. He told her things in January that he hadn't told her before, not in one conversation, not even deliberately, she thought. It was more that the long enforced proximity of winter and the quality of the dark outside made certain things easier to say inside. He told her about the army in pieces, the way you tell someone something you've been carrying a long time, a detail here, a name there, nothing complete but enough that she started to understand the shape of it. A battle in the Dakotas. A man named Garrett, who'd been his sergeant and the closest thing he'd had to a father, and who had died in a way Cole had spent 15 years believing he could have prevented. The years after the discharge, when he'd moved from place to place with no particular plan until Montana, which had asked nothing of him but work and had given him silence in return. And how the silence had been what he needed until it became what he was. "You were disappearing," she said one evening in late January. Not accusatorially, just naming a thing she'd understood. He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "And then you stopped." He looked at her. In the firelight, his face had the quality she'd come to love. And she let herself use the word now, in the privacy of her own thinking, because denying accurate words was a form of dishonesty she'd never had much patience for. The quality of a man who had survived things and not pretended otherwise, who had come through difficulty without the performance of having come through difficulty. "Something worth stopping for," he said quietly. She held his gaze across the fire for a moment. Then she looked back at her coffee, because some things needed to be approached slowly or not at all. He took down the fence in the first week of February. Not all of it, just the section at the corner where their two properties met, a run of about 60 feet, pulling the posts and stacking the rails in a neat pile that he said they'd need for the expanded pasture on the south side. She helped him pull the last post, both of them working it loose from the frozen ground, and when it came free they stood there for a moment looking at the gap in what had been a boundary. "That's one thing," she said. He looked at her. Something in his face had changed over the winter. Or maybe it hadn't changed and she was just seeing it more clearly now, the way landscape reveals itself when the snow starts to recede. The guardedness was still there, would always be there, she thought, woven too deep to come fully out. But underneath it, something else was visible now. Something that looked like a man who had decided to trust his own judgment about what was worth risking. "I need to say something," he said. "All right," she said. "I'm not easy to live near," he said. "You know that." I've lived near you for 8 months, she said. I have a reasonable sample size. I'm serious, Clara. So am I. She looked at him directly. You're solitary and you don't talk about things you should talk about, and you have the conversational instincts of a fence post. I know all of this. She paused. I'm still here. He looked at her for a long moment with that expression that was the closest he got to being unguarded. I don't have a lot to offer, he said. Compared to what Edmund offered me a version of something he'd imagined, she said. You've been offering me the actual thing every day for 8 months. I know which one I'd choose. He was quiet. Cole, she said, I burned the return ticket. I meant it for Edmund, and it turned out I meant it for something else entirely. She kept her voice steady. I'm not going anywhere. What I want to know is whether you're going anywhere. He looked at the gap in the fence line, at the open pasture beyond it that was both of theirs now, separated only by the absence of a boundary neither of them needed anymore. No, he said. I'm not going anywhere. She nodded. He nodded. It was not the most romantic declaration in the history of the frontier, and she would not have had it any other way. They were married in March, in the Harlan Creek Church, in a ceremony that lasted 20 minutes and was witnessed by Mrs. Aldis, the station master, Ruth Calloway, and the Halverson family, who came down from the North Valley with their wagon and their good boots, and Mrs. Halverson's particular expression of restrained satisfaction, as if events had confirmed something she'd assessed correctly from the start. Clara wore her second dress, the good one she'd brought from Philadelphia that she hadn't worn since the train, and Mercer wore a jacket she'd never seen before that fit him reasonably well, and that she suspected Ruth Calloway had quietly advised him to acquire. He was not comfortable in ceremonies. She could tell by the slight stiffness of his posture, the way he held still when he was working something through. But he said what needed to be said clearly and directly, looking at her face, and she said it back, and that was that. Afterward, at Mrs. Aldis's insistence, there was food. The boarding house table spread with what the community had collectively produced, which was considerable. Frontier generosity being the kind that operated in direct proportion to how much the people offering it could actually spare. Clara shook hands and accepted congratulations and watched Cole Mercer stand in the middle of a room full of people and manage it with the contained patience of a man who understood the social currency being offered and was accepting it even though it cost him something. She caught his eye across the room once, and he looked at her with the particular expression she'd been accumulating all winter, the one that was not quite a smile, but was better than a smile, the one that said, simply, you. She looked back at him and felt the same thing she'd been feeling since January when she'd stopped pretending she wasn't feeling it. Not the dizzy, airborne feeling of the letters, the feeling that lived in imagination. Something with more weight and texture. Something that knew the worst days, and the cold and the broken fence, and the man's silences and his scars, and the imperfect reality of building a life out of whatever materials the world actually gave you. That feeling, the real one. Spring came to the valley at the end of March, and into April, the way it came every year. Not all at once, but in negotiations. A warm week followed by a cold week, followed by 2 warm days. The snow receding a little further each time, the creek rising with the melt, the ground going from frozen to mud to something that would, eventually, be workable. She planted the garden in the 3rd week of April. Not experimentally this time, not for practice. She planted it with the full knowledge of what the soil would do, which beds drained fast and needed more moisture kept, which corner got the most afternoon sun, how deep the carrots wanted to be and how much space the squash would actually take, which she'd miscalculated last year. She planted it like someone who intended to harvest it, which she was. Cole helped her with the heavier work, turning the beds, moving the composted material she'd been building since fall, and then left her to the detailed work, which she preferred. She liked the planning itself, the small, precise decisions of it, the way it required the same kind of measured attention as sewing, the same careful hands, but with the enormous difference that what you made was living and would keep making itself if you got the conditions right. The cattle arrived in May. 12 head, a starter herd purchased through a man in Billings that Mercer had been corresponding with since February. They arrived in a state of mild indignation after the journey, and the first 2 days were consumed entirely with settling them, learning their individual temperaments, and repairing the section of expanded pasture fence that one particularly opinionated steer had decided to test immediately upon arrival. That one, Clara said, watching the steer from the fence rail. "He's going to be trouble." "All the good ones are," Mercer said. She looked at him sideways. "I mean the cattle," he said. She looked back at the steer. "Sure you do," she said. He made the sound, the dry, almost laugh that she'd been collecting since the first night, and that had become, over the months, one of her reliable measures of how things stood between them. When she heard it, things were all right. Better than all right. The summer was hard and good, and the particular combination that she'd come to understand was the only way things ever were on the frontier. Hard in ways that were specific and physical and occasionally demoralizing, good in ways that were also specific and physical and therefore real. The cattle required more daily management than she'd anticipated. The north pasture fence gave them trouble twice in June. A week of July brought rain that flooded the low corner of the garden and cost her 2 rows of beans, which she replanted and mostly lost anyway. And the hay came up good on the south slope, and they got it cut and baled before the rains. And the potatoes produced in October exactly what she'd calculated they'd produce. And the herd was healthy and growing, and the combined property, her 70 acres and his 60, 130 acres of Montana Valley, with a creek and 2 cabins and a barn that Mercer was rebuilding from the studs out, was beginning to look like a working enterprise rather than a hope. Ruth Calloway came to visit in September and walked the property with Clara and said, at the end of it, "You built this." "We built it," Clara said. "Don't let modesty make you dishonest," Ruth said. "You built most of it, and he had the sense to let you." Clara thought about this. She thought about the return ticket in the fire, and the north wall chinking, and the lean-to roof, and the winter, and the fence post they'd pulled out of the frozen ground together. She thought about the ledger with the accounts, and the back pages with the small writing that was just hers. She thought about what it had cost and what it had made. "We both built it," she said. "Different parts." Ruth looked at her for a moment with the expression of a woman who had her own parallel understanding of what was true and had decided not to argue. "Fine," she said. "You built it together." That, Clara thought, was exactly right. The knowledge that she was pregnant arrived in October, though she'd suspected it since the end of September, and she sat with it alone for a week before she told Cole, not because she was afraid of his reaction, but because she wanted the time to understand her own before she had to manage anyone else's. She'd always needed that. The time to find her own center on something before the world weighed in. Her own reaction, when she got down to the bottom of it, was not the fear she might have expected. It was more like recognition, the sense of something arriving that she'd been moving toward without fully knowing it, the way the spring had arrived and the garden and the cattle and everything else, as the result of work and intention and some element that was neither just life doing what it did when the conditions were right. She told him on a Tuesday evening after supper. She said it plainly, the way she said most things, watching his face as she said it. What happened to his face in that moment was something she would carry for the rest of her life. Not an explosion of feeling. He was not a man for that. More like a door opening inward, a deep, private interior suddenly accessible, a look of such unguarded and complete feeling that she understood things about him in those 5 seconds that she hadn't entirely understood, in a year of working beside him, sleeping beside him, building a life beside him. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said quietly, "You're sure?" "I'm sure," she said. He nodded slowly. He looked at the table, at his hands, at the window that was properly seated in its frame now, and had been for 11 months. When he looked back at her, his eyes were doing something she hadn't seen them do before. "I didn't think," he started. Stopped. She waited. "I stopped thinking I'd have this," he said. It cost him something to say it. She could hear that. "A long time ago. I stopped thinking it was something that was going to happen for me." She reached across the table and put her hand over his. He turned his hand and held hers, and neither of them said anything else for a while. And the fire burned, and the October wind came through the pines outside, and the world was exactly the size it needed to be. Rose Mercer was born in June, 3 weeks before the anniversary of the day Clara had stepped off the train at Harlan Creek Station with 43 cents in a worn leather bag and a hope that had nowhere else to go. The birth was not easy. Nothing honest ever is. Mrs. Halverson came down and stayed 3 days and was exactly the person Clara needed her to be. Competent, direct, unfrightened, The kind of woman who treated difficulty as a practical problem rather than a catastrophe. Cole was in the room for some of it, and outside for some of it, and somewhere in between for the rest, doing what men did in those situations, which was find physical tasks to keep themselves from being useless. And she could hear him through the wall, sometimes doing things that didn't strictly need doing. When it was over and she held Rose for the first time, small and dark-haired and furiously opinionated from the first minute, she heard him come back into the room and felt his presence at the edge of the bed and looked up. His face again. That face. The door-opening quality of it. Rose, she said, because she'd decided on the name months ago and hadn't told him, wanted to see his face when he heard it. He said nothing. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the small person who had not existed until this morning and who now clearly intended to exist at considerable volume and for as long as possible. And he put one careful finger against her small hand, and she closed her fist around it with the grip of something that already knew how to hold on. Clara watched this happen. She thought about the letters. She thought about Edmund writing about Montana like it was something he'd built, and how she'd read those letters in the back of a dry goods store and felt the first movement of something she didn't have a name for yet. She thought about what it meant that the letter had taken her to a train, and the train to a station, and the station to a man who wasn't there, and how she'd burned the return ticket and stayed, and what she had now was nothing like what the letters had promised, and everything like what she'd actually needed. That's the thing no one tells you about hope. Not the cautionary version, not the cynical version, the actual truth of it, the one that only shows up in retrospect. Hope is not dangerous because it leads you toward things that don't exist. Hope is complicated because it leads you toward things you couldn't have imagined. You aim at the target you can see and end up somewhere else entirely, and the somewhere else is realer and more valuable than the target was, but you'd never have moved without the target in the first place. She'd come 2,000 miles for a man who wasn't there, and what she'd found was a life she hadn't known to want, not rescued into it, not lucky into it, but worked into it day by day, fence post by fence post, the north wall and the lean-to roof, and the frozen ground and the cattle and the garden that kept producing beyond her expectations, like the Montana soil itself, which gave back more than you put in if you put in enough. The woman who had stepped off that train with 43 cents was not the woman holding Rose in the June light. Not because she'd been transformed into something better. She'd been humbled and tested and had failed at things and succeeded at others, and was still imperfect in all the ways she'd always been imperfect. But she'd stayed. Through every piece of it, she'd stayed. And staying, it turned out, was its own kind of extraordinary thing. The homestead was quieter in the evenings now, paradoxically. Rose slept in a way that demanded absolute stillness and got it. Even Cole moved differently in the cabin now. That large, careful economy of movement applied to the new task of not waking a person who was smaller than his arm and entirely in charge. One evening in late June, when Rose was asleep and the day's work was done and the last light was doing what Montana light did in summer, staying past the point of reason, filling the sky long after it had any right to. She and Cole sat on the step of the cabin the way they'd begun doing in their first summer together, without discussing it, just arriving there at the end of the day. The valley below them was green and long, the creek catching the late light in the distance. The cattle were shapes in the south pasture. The garden was thriving in a way that she'd stopped being surprised by and started simply accepting as what happened when you learned what you were doing. "You're thinking," he said. "I'm always thinking," she said. "What about?" She looked at the valley. "About the train station, June last year." She paused. "I was so certain I'd made a catastrophic mistake." He was quiet for a moment. "Had you?" "No," she said. "I'd made the right mistake, the one that got me here." He didn't say anything to that, but she felt him shift slightly beside her, the way he moved when something had landed and he was taking it in. She'd learned to read the small language of him, the way she'd learned to read the sky and the soil. Through attention, over time, with the understanding that what mattered was rarely the loudest thing. "Cole?" she said. Are you happy?" The question sat in the evening air, a question she'd wondered about for months, and hadn't asked because she'd been afraid of the answer, or afraid he wouldn't know how to answer, or afraid it was a word that didn't apply to a man who'd carried what he'd carried. He thought about it. That was one of the things she'd come to love about him, the way he didn't give the easy answer but sat with a question until he had the honest one. I don't know if happy's the right word, he said finally. I know that I want to be here. Every day I want to be here. He paused. I didn't want that for a long time. To be anywhere. He looked at the valley and then at her. I want to be here. She nodded. That was enough, more than enough. It was, in fact, exactly what she'd asked. Inside the cabin, Rose made a small sound. Not a cry, just a stir, the sound of someone checking that the world was still there. And then went quiet again. The light held on a little longer, the way it did. Clara Mercer sat on the step of her homestead on a June evening in 1882 and looked at the valley she'd learned to read like a language, and felt the particular, unglamorous, irreplaceable weight of a life that was genuinely hers. Not the life anyone had promised her, not the life she'd imagined reading letters in a back room in Philadelphia. The life that had required everything she had to build, and had given back more than she'd known to ask for. The woman who'd arrived at the station with nowhere to go had gone exactly as far as she needed to, and she had stayed,